So they were preparing to engage, and at that point, that was before all the slash and burn stuff, which was after the Civil War that General Sherman did. Prior to that, they did not have fires. They did not want to give away their location because of smoke and all of this. They took over that tan house, which you may have seen coming in out there on the road. That was built in 1851. I don't know what happened to the people, whether they were, I don't know, but they used that as their little staging area. They were just here for a few weeks as all the troops were getting together for the big clash. Of course, all of that was done kind of covertly. And I have a friend who's also in the caving world, that being Marion Smith, who's a Civil War absolute expert. And he explained all this stuff to me that just melted my heart. And another thing that he told me about was the Battle of Chickamauga had the largest number of Confederate guerrillas. These are the people who fought their own war. They weren't, they didn't obey. They had their own little army of people. They fought to die. This was their land. They were not going to leave. He told me that. It just made me cry. It was a big thing that went on then. And so that took place then. Prior to that, another thing that took place, and this is what Russell Cave is also all about 4,000 years ago was when the Woodland Indians had migrated across the continent, and they stayed here as well as at Russell Cave. And that, it wasn't because they were Neanderthal or anything like that. They didn't have anything else. They were wanderers. And when they got here, they stayed in the cave briefly as they built their village. And some anthropologists came here shortly after the Conservancy had acquired this cave. There was a group that came down from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville and did some studies, and I said I'd agree to them studying as long as I got to learn from them. And so they explained all this stuff to me. There was probably about 1,500 people living in this area, which is more than live here now. And they had their own, farms and stuff that they developed in their cabins that they built. And in the cave there is some what we call glyphs, which were just a spiritual thing, things of the sun and this. They're small, but they're in special places.
Controversial and revolutionary concept. In order to preserve access and conserve these caves, we're going to buy them, and we're going to raise money from cavers to do it. At the time, many people thought that this was impossible. People who like to crawl in holes in the ground, don't have a lot of money, and they're kind of cheap. This would absolutely fail. Well, here we stand 23 years later. We now own 27 or manage 27 preserves, including one that I just signed on the dotted line to buy yesterday.
Awesome. Cool.
That I can't tell you about because we're going to announce at a big fundraising event next weekend. But we're really excited about it. We protect about 1,500 acres of property, like I said, on 27 preserves, over 120 caves that we protect. And one of the reasons for our success is that we have managed to balance conservation of caves with recreational access. That's a very difficult challenge that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. And it's one that many state and the federal government, we think, have not done as good a job as we have done. Many of them have erred on the side of complete closure in the face of the threat created by white nose syndrome. And there are various issues with that we can talk about later. But what we find that if people can't go to a cave, they stop caring about it. And eventually, and not only that, but the people who go to the caves that care about them help protect them. We had a cave, that's the largest graybat hibernaculum in the world, Fern Cave, get vandalized because both we and the federal government closed all of our respectively owned entrances and then essentially abandoned them for 3 years. And when we came back to look at the cave, we found that it had been vandalized by people who just didn't care about it, who had been in the previous 18 years kept away by regular visitation from recreational cavers. So we have this balance of protecting caves and the ecosystems. There are many rare and endangered plants and endangered species that are endemic to the caves. In other words, they're found nowhere else on Earth, and I'm sure Wes can talk about that. But at the same time, we allow people to enjoy those. And some caves, this Frick's Cave is an unusual cave for us because it's closed to recreational access 364 days a year. We only open it one day a year when the bats are not in residence to allow people to come into this cave.
With controlled access on that.
With very controlled access,
And
right.
people who are responsible and been deconned so that there will not be carriers.
So we have, I think we've succeeded in that. We actually raised money from cavers to buy this cave preserve, even though they knew that they probably weren't going to get to go in it very much, which we think speaks very well of the caving community. And as a conservancy, in the last 22 years, we've raised about $2 million to buy caves, primarily from cavers. And we're now embarking on a strategic plan that we developed for the first time in our history that we're looking to double and then triple the number of caves that we protect by expanding our donor base and getting the word out that not only are these great places for people to enjoy underground, but there's awesome resources for hiking and just nature enjoyment above ground as well. And so we really want to get the message out that what we do is very important. It helps to protect the water quality of drinking water and habitat, water resources. It's more than just recreational caving. And so we're really excited that you guys are all here today. It's sort of an unanticipated benefit for us of the federal government shutdown.
Who stay here is the gray bats, which are, they were originally classified as endangered. Now they've realized there's a little more than they thought there was, but they're on the protected, I think that's
No,
what they
no, they're still federally endangered.
Still?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so this is one of the few caves that they will stay in, and that's the reason this was bought, to protect them. They live, their hibernaculum, where they hibernate in the winter, and their maternity cave was Fern Cave, that you heard Ron mention earlier, which is over near Scottsboro, Alabama. When the summer rolls around and they come out of hibernation, the bats without mates will leave that cave and they go out into caves such as this, where they will eat and enjoy the summer. And this was explained to me by a young man working on his PhD who was here for a year doing studies of the bats. He explained that the proper word was a bachelor cave.
I was just going to say, is it a
I
bachelor?
said, it's a singles cave. He said, yeah. So it's not bachelor as in just males without mates. It's male and female without mates. And just teasing him, I said, well, then the next year they'll be in the maternity cave. He said, yeah. So anyway, they come here in the summertime, and they also will go back and forth between this cave and a cave near Somerville, Georgia, which is called Lowry Cave, and Nickajack Cave. And the young man really did a tremendous study. He found, learned a lot of stuff that was not known. He even had, this our tax dollars at work, he put transponders on these bats. And when they would fly away, there was a black helicopter that would track them. He knew where they were going. This was a tremendous project. And there was a lot to be learned. And the bat life cycle is, how long do y'all think a bat lives?
Couple of years.
Just a few years? They live 30 to 40 years.
Wow.
And that is the reason why the stuff with the white nose syndrome is so critical, because when you look at a low number of bats, with that kind of life cycle, I mean, you can kind of imagine the math. If you lose some, something with that life cycle, they don't recover. The species doesn't recover that easily. If they only live 3 or 4 years, you say, oh, well, they can come back, but no, not when they have that kind of a life cycle. And they have a very complex social structure. They're very intelligent.
With that great segue, Mr. Davis, and thank you very much, let me defer now to
Oh,
Brian
okay.
Carver, who is something of an expert on the life cycle of bats and can tell us a little bit more about the kinds of bats that we see in Tennessee and what some of the ecological pressures on them are. Brian?
Sure. Well, one of the things a lot of the general public, when people think about bats, they think about caves, right? This is classic setting for most people. Well, it's a cave, so there must be bats. And a lot of caves, though, actually never get used by bats. The cave, just like anywhere else, has to have the right kind of climatic settings. The temperature has to be right, the humidity has to be right, the airflow has to be right in order for those bats to use it. And gray bats are an interesting example. Most of the bats in the southeastern United States use caves only in the winter for hibernation or not at all. There's a number of bat species that don't use caves at all. The gray bats are the only bat species in this area that use caves year-round. But like our other folks have been talking about, they actually swap between winter caves, which tend to be very cold and trap cold air, so it's perfect for hibernation, very stable. But it's too cold to raise young. To raise young, if you're a mammal, you've got this warm body temperature, you need to be in a warmer environment. So they go to warmer caves for the summer. Now, for a bachelor colony, they're not quite as picky because they're not raising young, right? There's no babies there in a bachelor colony. So it is mostly males, a few females that didn't breed. The maternity colonies are going to be in different caves that often have a domed ceiling that traps the heat from, in many cases, tens of thousands of individuals all together in one place. One of the reasons that gray bats are still on the endangered species list and were put there in the first place, we actually estimate their numbers to be probably at least 10 million individuals, which sounds like a lot for an endangered species, but 90% of all of the gray bats hibernate in only 9 caves. So you can imagine what would happen to the entire population if something happened to just those few caves. And lately we've been going in quickly every year to see if white nose syndrome is there and is impacting those bats. So a lot of our other bats, though, are only going to use those caves in the wintertime. And then in the summer, they're going to go out on the landscape and they're going to roost often under the bark of dead trees. And this is going to include some other endangered species like the Indiana bat. Earlier this week, you may not have heard about it because of the federal government shutdown, but I got a quick email and it never made the official press release, I don't think. But the northern long-eared bat has been formally proposed by the Fish and Wildlife Service for listing as endangered. And it's because of white nose syndrome. And it's going to do the same kind of thing. It's in caves in the winter. And then it's going to go out on the landscape in the summertime, in some cases hundreds of miles away from where it is in the winter. So when we talk about things like white nose syndrome, we're concerned about things like people going in caves, picking up these fungal spores, because it's a fungus that causes it, carrying it to a new place. But I think very early on, the caving community got a really bad rap from a lot of biologists. We put a lot of blame on cavers and said, hey, we think this came from Europe and cavers are spreading it, it's cavers' fault, it's cavers' fault. Well, the reality is these bats, too, are going hundreds of miles, and they are going to summering grounds, intermingling with other bats that may have come from hundreds of miles away. So you get this central area that they come to in the summer, and then they go back. So you could easily see how this fungus could spread 500 miles in one winter from some bats that came 250 miles one way and some that came 250 miles another way. So it is a very complex picture of trying to deal with this situation and protect the species. Caves in general, the gray bat was put on the list because of disturbance, human disturbance. And we've gotten a lot better. There are some very responsible cavers out there, and we get a lot of great data from some of those folks. There's also, unfortunately, some very irresponsible cavers out there, and people like the SCCA don't like that because it gives a bad name to the caving community and is very unfortunate. But historically, bat numbers like the gray bat have come down because of human visits in the winter when the bats are hibernating, damage to caves. People go in, they spray paint graffiti, they set fires, they do all kinds of things. They spray chemicals in caves. A lot of caves have been used as, historically those were the dumps, right? That's where you took your trash, you go find a sinkhole, you throw it in the hole. We've filled others in because of liability concerns. TVA, unfortunately, has submerged a lot of caves. We've built a lot of dams and impounded and brought the water up. Nickajack Cave, luckily, is not completely submerged. It's the site where gray bats were originally discovered. And now to get to the entrance, you got to go by boat. So some of those caves have been lost. So we've been trying to protect what's left, do a lot better job educating the public. And in a lot of arenas, we've had a lot of success. The gray bat, as was mentioned, the numbers have been stable to increasing, and there was very serious talk among the Fish and Wildlife Service personnel and other biologists about totally delisting the bat, or at least downlisting it to threaten. Then white nose syndrome came on the scene and everybody said, hold your horses. let's not jump the gun. It would look really bad to the public if we delist it and then we turn around 2 years later and have to put it back on. So we're really in a wait and see phase with gray bats. We've seen white nose syndrome in gray bats. We haven't seen a lot of mortality yet, but we may have it. The core of the species range in the winter is much farther south than where we've seen a lot of die-offs in the northeastern U.S.
Dr. Stone, I wonder if you could come up this way because it might be a little easier for the group since we are all sort of oriented in one direction. And tell us a little bit. Oh my gosh, he's got exhibits.
Got dead bats.
Dead bats. All right. Do you need any help with anything?
I might.
All right.
I think Brian's here to help me out.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Dr. Stone is our white nose syndrome expert.
Well, I wouldn't call myself that, but I am a wildlife biologist who works on bats. And since I've been working on bats, I've been involved with white nose syndrome. In the last little while now, I've been involved like Brian here in the Southeast Bat Diversity Network for, more than a decade now. And I recall the conversations we had about delisting this particular species, the gray bat. And, you know, we were really seriously thinking we could take it off the list. And, of course, you know, we would have jumped the gun by 2 years, and that wouldn't have been a good thing with the white nose syndrome that was detected in 2006 up in New York. It's been making its way down the Appalachian chain, and then, well, it's gone in all different kind of directions up in Canada and even out in the Midwest now, but it's in our region coming down the Appalachian Mountains, so we were kind of expecting it. And this is a actual mummified gray bat. I didn't kill this bat. I want everybody to know I didn't kill this bat. This is a listed species. I only have it because I do have a permit to collect these, but I got this particular individual at the entrance of another cave over in Alabama, my neck of the woods, Sauda Cave, which is very close to Tennessee River. Sauda Cave, you know, we can go there any summer night and see 300,000 bats fly out. And it's kind of hard to explain to people, but that's an endangered species as they're swarming around you everywhere. But that's where I got this particular individual, and I thought I'd bring a few because I wasn't sure we'd be able to get in to the cave because you know the sensitivity now of caves to people going in them. I guess, and I'll pass these bats around if you like to look. I've got several different species. I've got a northern myotis, northern long-eared myotis that Brian was mentioning that we thought was pretty rare in Alabama. We started catching quite a few of them, especially in the summertime. But this last summer, while I've been catching, I've only caught one. So this is a species that we're concerned about being listed. My students do this, so pardon the poor sewing job on some of these. But that's the northern long-eared bat. And I've got some tricolored now, they call them. I'm still calling them pips because I grew up in a different era before they changed the name. And that was a very common bat, our most common bat. And in Russell Cave, where we went a couple years ago, we counted more than 1,000 of these tricolored bats that were hibernating there. And last winter when we went in there, or I guess this March, we actually had more pipistrelles in there than before, but they're showing signs of white nose syndrome, which up north of us has been killing 99% of the bats that hibernate in caves. And the common tricolored bat may one of these days, like the northern long-eared myotis, become one of those that we're talking about as an endangered species. So like the passenger pigeon, just because you're abundant one day doesn't mean you're around the next day. We thought it was going to hit in 2011. We didn't detect it then, but in 2012 we went over to Russell Cave National Monument. It's part of the Park Service. That's why we weren't able to go there today because the parks are closed. And the cave had been closed for 9 years, back 2 years ago. No one had gone in it, and they had it closed. And they let us go in and go through there and look for white nose. We did, and it looked pretty good. We even left National Park Service property and entered onto private land underground. It's a rather long cave. We were underground for 6 hours going through there. And when we got near the end, we started picking up bats that looked kind of suspicious. And here's the pictures of the first ones we caught. And you can see a little bit of white fungus if you're close. If you're not, try and imagine. I'm sorry, the poster's kind of fading since February when we had the meeting. But it was the best thing I had to bring out here. And some of these bats, they almost look like they had flown through a spider web or something. They were just sort of encased in this, you know. There was fungus on their nose, fungus on their wings, fungus on their hair, fungus on their tail, fungus in their ears, and on their face, and just everywhere. And so it was pretty obvious that that's what we had. One of the Park Service people was from up north, and they had seen it before and said, yep, that's it, all right. And sure enough, when we sent it to the lab to get tested, it was the dreaded white nose syndrome fungus. And what's the new name of the genus now?
Pseudogymnoascus.
They
It was
just-
Geomyces.
Right.
It just was renamed about in July.
Yeah, I was over in China looking at bats this summer when they renamed it. I came back and said they renamed it because I liked using the GD, the GD fungus. But now I have to change that and learn the new name, I guess, because they did come up with a new genus name for the fungus. But sure enough, that's what we had, and now it's been detected in other places, mainly through swabbing in our state. And next week, in fact, in 2 days, our state working group is having a major bat capturing exercise. We're all going to try and get together, even some people from Georgia and Tennessee, and as far as Oklahoma, are coming to help us.
At the time, we really didn't understand white nose syndrome at the SCCI. We kind of considered it to be a problem in the Northeast and something that sucked for them, but really didn't affect us at all. And the cave closure advisor was a huge wake-up call for us. So our first response was to close all of our caves until we really got a handle on what was going on. And we spent a lot of time researching the issue and finding out more about white nose syndrome. And in May of that year, we decided to reopen all of our caves that didn't have significant populations of hibernating bats, whether they be bats that were actually using them as hibernacula in the winter, or bats that are using them as bachelor or maternity colonies at other times of the year. We kept closed all of the caves that were used by significant populations of hibernating bats because at the time white nose was 1,000 miles away, and we absolutely did not want to be the cave conservancy that was responsible
Get it first.
for a 1,000-mile jump of white nose syndrome as a result of a visit from a recreational caver from a northeast cave to a southeast cave. And so we left all of our significant bat caves closed for 3 years. We took some flack from our donors about that, but we felt really strongly that that was an important management policy that we needed to follow. And then in March of last year, we decided to reopen our significant bat caves back to the schedule that we had previously established for them. And we completely agree with Brian that human disturbance is a critical problem with bat survivability. And so we don't allow anyone to go in our caves when bats are in residence. And that continues to be the case. But we felt that for those caves, white nose syndrome is now here. It's in the area. It's in Tennessee. It's in Alabama, and it's in Northwest Georgia. We're no longer at risk of being responsible for a major jump in the spread of the disease, and so unfortunately the bats are doing a marvelous job of spreading it themselves, and there's really nothing that we can do. We have placed restrictions on visitation for all of those significant bat caves. We absolutely require any visitor to decontaminate or disinfect all of their gear before and after visiting the cave. That also has proven somewhat controversial within cavers, and we'd like to move beyond the whole issue of white nose syndrome and promote a concept of what we call clean caving. Sort of an oxymoron, you're getting muddy, and it's how do you do clean caving? But when we go from one cave to another, if we transport the mud, the soil, the water from one cave to another, we are at risk of moving not just the fungus that causes white nose, but also potential other microbes that we can't even see. And we could be responsible for the extinction of a species that isn't even discovered yet, because caves are these isolated ecosystems in many cases, and there are these populations that have evolved in that cave that exist nowhere else. And there are some caves out west where researchers have found new species of microbes in caves, some of which have a potential to fight disease, potentially cancer. And so we really want to preserve the ecosystems within the cave, and that includes the microbial ecosystem. It's easy to think about bats because we can see them and they're wonderful and furry, but there are microbes that live in the caves, and so we're promoting this concept of clean caving to get people to just clean their gear in between caves and reduce that risk. It's kind of a risk management approach. And the last thing I want to say about white-nose and Fricks is that, unfortunately, in late February of this year, during our open house that we had for the first time in 4 years at Fricks, one of the cavers noticed pretty obvious signs of white-nose fungus on a bat in this cave, and we got permission from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources to collect the bat, and unfortunately it came back positive for white nose. But absolutely, this cave had not been visited in 4 years, so there's no question that the white nose fungus that affected that bat came from other bats that had flown in the area. So we're following this adaptive management. We're kind of trying to get better as we go along. And the amazing thing is that that concept is starting to spread. The state of Tennessee, which currently has all of their publicly owned caves closed to all recreational visitation, is actually looking to the Southeastern Cave Conservancy as a model for cave management. And this maintaining permits and maintaining, requiring disinfection is really something that state managers are now looking to try to adopt themselves as they seek to reopen their caves to visitation.
Well, let's take some questions.
Yep, I see a lot of hands.
Why don't we start with you, John?
Has there been much WNS mortality this far south in Tennessee and Georgia?
I have not seen it myself. I only survey about 4 or 5 Ks in the springtime, and like I said, we actually, from a cave that had been closed 9 years, before white nose was even in the country, we saw a major, probably about 10% of the bats had it. And I was looking all around the floor because I'd heard and read reports. Sometimes they're hanging there dead, sometimes they're dead on the floor. So I was looking all over trying to see, what kind of mortality we having. I did not see a dead bat the first year we went. Now last year I got about 3 dead bats, and they were hanging on the wall dead, none of them that I found on the ground, which isn't a whole lot. And there were actually more bats in the cave. Still had white nose, but more bats in the cave last year, so we haven't seen the impact yet.
Does
But
it just not get as cold down here as it does in the Northeast?
Well,
'Cause
that's a good question for a scientist, and that's what we're thinking, that we have a shorter hibernation season. When the bats fly out, perhaps it'll be warmer. Maybe they don't have to, maybe they even go in with a little bit more reserves, because the way that the white nose syndrome kills the bats, by the way, is what kind of related to what Brian was saying. The white nose, the fungus kind of irritates them, and they wake up in the middle of in the winter when they're not supposed to, and they use up precious fat reserves. So essentially they starve to death because the white nose fungus bothers them on the nose.
There is also some evidence from the northeastern U.S. is we seem to see a lag time of about 3 years between initial discovery of white nose syndrome and when we start to see large-scale mortality events.
Right. So maybe
So
this
we're
year.
really starting to wonder. In Tennessee, we started to see a little bit more mortality last year over in the Smokies. Certainly nothing on the scale yet of what they've seen in the Northeast, where you almost don't see any live bats. Everything's dead or on the floor of the cave. So we haven't seen that yet, but it looks like our first discovery of white nose in Tennessee was over in the Smokies and the Appalachians in the extreme eastern part of the state. We've now documented it pretty much everywhere we've looked in the state. I mean, there's still caves we haven't found it yet, but virtually every county that we visited last year and looked in caves, we could find it. So we really are right now left wondering, are we just waiting for that 3-year window? Will it be a 4-year window in the south, or will the warmer caves, the shorter hibernation period, give the bats a better chance of survival? So we just don't know the answer to that question. We also, like I mentioned before, we're in the gray bat territory now, and it's been discovered on gray bats and in gray bat caves. Gray bats are larger as far as body size than the bats that have been hardest hit. So the big brown bat has a lower mortality rate, apparently from white nose syndrome. We're hoping that may be true for gray bats because they're a little bigger. Maybe that gives them a better chance as well. So there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of very active investigation that's going on with trying to document what's happening with these populations. Because, you know, historically we didn't do counts in a lot of these caves, so we didn't really know how many bats were there, and we certainly didn't do counts every year or look for these kinds of scenarios. So we're much more active in this.
Yeah, I wasn't much of a caver working on bats. I let the bats come to me, you know, instead of going to the bats. But you know, it's kind of worth pointing out that not every bat lives in a cave or hibernates in a cave. This is a red bat. And I've been catching a lot of these this summer, and they don't go into caves. But I've been getting lower numbers of tricolors, which go into caves, more than long-eared myotis. And I know I hardly ever catch any gray bats or Indianas, but other species of cave bats, that's why we're having the bat blitz, especially where we're having it over in the Jackson, Madison County area of Alabama, because we're right on the fringe, you know, of it coming down, and we wanted to see that. But you know, we depended on the cavers to help us do this research. I mean, you want to talk about getting into some of these caves, you want a guide that knows what they're doing. And so I'm proud to say that our group's kind of been working with the cavers instead of, you know, in opposition to the cavers. They are these unknowns, and so you have to be cautious. At the same time, we are starting to find out more about how it's moving and the fact that the bats are spreading it. Even if you take the you know, the clean caving idea, it must be contagious because the Fish and Wildlife Service folks are singing it to us all the time. And we'll be deconning, you know, right and left, but nobody decons the bats. They fly all over. So it's been on the move. Nothing has seemed to have really stopped it. We are hoping to slow the spread. But depending on the species of bat, some bats hang out more in the entrance of the cave and they don't get down in the deep part of the cave, and they may be lower at risk.
Lots of people have lots of ideas.
Yeah, I get lots of
Fungicides were
ideas.
discussed early on, very, you know, seriously as we were throwing out every kind of possible idea. And you can imagine, if you know very much about fungi, think about the closest similar thing in humans would probably be athlete's foot. It can be pretty tough to clear up, right? So just spraying something on a bat one time probably isn't going to get rid of your problem. But the bigger issue becomes caves are entire ecosystems, and we can't narrow our focus to just think about bats. So fungi are a critical component of that cave ecosystem, and there are lots of very beneficial fungi in those systems. So the energy sources are coming in from things like bats flying in and defecating in the cave, some of them falling off and dying like they've always done, you know, periodically in the caves. Detritus, leaf litter, things like that washing down into the caves. And then there's the microbes that are breaking that down, and there's cave millipedes and cave spiders and cave salamanders and cave fish. There's all kinds of, many of these are endangered as well. So we just can't go in and do something like that because we have to think about everything else that's there.
There was an effort to build an artificial cave in Tennessee that could be decontaminated. Do you know anything about that?
I know a little bit. So that cave, that artificial cave, was built by the Nature Conservancy, and the lead project scientist for that, he and I are pretty close friends, and that was basically an effort to see, first of all, can we attract bats to it? It's built very near to an existing gray bat cave, so we want to try to mimic those conditions. Unfortunately, it was completed last year very late. Because of holdups from the state fire marshal's office, of all things. There's a whole interesting story there. And so it wasn't ready for the bats to move in as early as we wanted to. Really, some of the bats had begun picking their hibernation sites before it was even really available. They did have some equipment set up to monitor. They didn't go in it at all over the winter, but had some equipment to see if bats were going in and out. They had a little bit of activity, and it was set up so they can go back and actually decontaminate in the summer when the bats are gone, and to be able in the future to do some kind of experimental studies to see, you know, maybe we don't want to use a fungicide wide scale, but maybe there's selected places where, you know, once again, maybe it's worth the trade-off. There's not anything else that we're going to imperil there, and we can make this a preserve. You know, I think a lot of us don't feel that's necessarily a likely feasible solution, but it's certainly worth investigating. So that's still in the early stages. We should get better data out of that this year.
Cool.
Other questions? Michael?
Couple. So just so I'm clear, white nose is not a concern with bats that don't go in caves, right? Is that correct? The
It kills
fungus.
them while they're hibernating in
correct.
caves.
Right.
Basically, what's happening is when bats are hibernating,
Right.
their immune system is shut down. And for most things, that's okay, because if you had a virus, that virus is going to grow most quickly, or a bacterial infection. It's going to grow when your body's warm. So if
Right.
your body's cold, it's not growing, so you don't really need your immune system to fight it off. So when you warm back up and your immune system's working, then everything's good. This fungus is unique because it's a cold-loving fungus. It grows best at very cool temperatures. So the temperature we're at right now is well below its optimum growth temperature. So it's growing the best when the bats are inactive. So for the bats that don't hibernate, they'll lower their body temperature a little bit every day while they sleep. And they may go through some longer inactive periods in the winter, a few days now and then, but they're active enough that we think that the fungus just never gets a foothold.
And
with them.
bats that don't go in caves don't hibernate.
Correct. They will go into, again, these periods of torpor, like the red bats that we were looking at, where they'll get down in the leaf litter on the forest floor, or even occasionally in an animal burrow when it's really, really cold. But on warmer nights, they'll come out and feed. And they often migrate long distance. So
Here's the
some of them may
migrator.
have been in Canada.
He's not a hibernator, he's a migrator.
Right, and then they'll come down to parts much farther south in the winter. So they're never actually hibernating. And so it's a much lower risk issue.
And how many species do you have total in the southeast?
That's a good question. Tennessee, we have 16 possible species, 14 that we know are in the state on a fairly regular basis. A couple more that are right on the borderline that might show up every once in a while. When you move farther south, southern Florida, you pick up a few extra species, some more tropical species, the Jamaican fruit bat, for example, and a few other much more southern species. But those bats aren't going to be impacted by white nose syndrome. So we're looking at out of the realistically in the northeastern U.S. and kind of from here north, about 15 species of bats, and somewhere around a little over half of those are at risk from white nose syndrome.
And that's considerably more than in the northeast, right? As far as
We're gonna, as we move farther north, we're gonna have fewer species of bats. So yes, there are several species we've got here that we're kind of on the edge of the range, and they won't be found in the northeastern U.S.
Yeah, the hoary bat here, it migrates. It's a close cousin of this red bat, and so it doesn't hibernate. So there are some species that are not, they haven't been discovered on them yet, and probably aren't going to get it at all. The jury's still been adding new species as late as early, I guess, as a year ago, when they added the last species that they found it on. So as it moves further south, it's going to perhaps, get more species. But
And especially as
yeah.
it moves west.
Yeah.
That's one of the really big concerns is the disease moving farther west. And all of the western species in the Rocky Mountains and California and those kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Do we know if it's crossed the continental divide?
It is not, as far as we know. But again, there's always real risks for that. We had a request in Tennessee last year. Some photojournalists wanted to come over and do a story in Tennessee from California and take a bunch of pictures in caves. And we told them no, because we didn't want them bringing their cameras into a cave in Tennessee and possibly picking up the fungus and taking it back to California. We haven't seen it the farthest west I know of. The fungus has been detected about 5 years ago now in the panhandle of Oklahoma. But they've never detected actual sick bats in Oklahoma, so there's some question about whether or not that was a fluke. But in the past couple of years, we've seen it across the Mississippi. There are records of the fungus in Arkansas now, in Missouri, including mortality from white nose syndrome in Missouri. So it's been steadily progressing, and we expect that to continue. There are fewer caves, though, as you go across, the heart of the continent. So we would expect that movement maybe to be a little bit slower, but
drier climate too.
right,
Which
which
may
can
play
certainly
a
impact
role
things.
with fungus.
You had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit more about your expectations for how the disease will progress and what is going to happen to bats in the United States generally. What do you think?
Did you bring your crystal ball? You got one, okay.
I think our expectations have been improving a little bit. When this first came on the scene, really when it first showed up, we started to see these bats with the fungus, and then all of a sudden, because it had apparently been there a couple of years, when it was first documented, some cavers came back and said, "Oh, I've got a picture from a year ago of something like this, and so it had already been there a couple of years, and so we started seeing this mass mortality just right away, and it's been so bad in the northeastern U.S. So a lot of us really, our hearts sank, and we said, man, we're going to see mass extinction of a bunch of bats in the next few years, in the next couple of decades. I think we're now much more cautiously optimistic that hopefully we won't see any extinctions. It's definitely still a possibility. Some species seem to be hit much harder than others, and so we don't really know for sure what's going to happen. One of the things that gives us a little hope is the story from Europe, because we think the fungus came from Europe, and it's been genetically traced back to an identical fungus in Europe, and yet there are no bats dying in Europe. And the most common theory now is that fungus went through bats in Europe a few hundred years ago, a few thousand years ago, 20,000 years ago, who knows? But in Europe, they have quite a few bat species, but all of their bats are in very low numbers compared to what we have. They're just not very common, not high densities. So there's some thinking that maybe that's because this went through their bats, and that's what was left, and the populations just haven't recovered. Maybe they will eventually recover more. So we may be looking at a future with our cave species much more like what you find in Europe, where the bats may still be around, but we talk about sometimes this idea of an ecological extinction, right? We talk about that with species like the eastern hemlock, that they're probably going to be wiped out. I'm sure there'll be a few here and there, but they're not really going to be on the landscape anymore. And it may be that way with some of our bats. But a lot of the forest is gone. A lot of these things are somewhat also indications of overall ecosystem health. It's not just the caves. So that can play a role in it. And, if you have the right kind of, especially summer habitat where they can go and breed, then maybe they do stand a chance of recovering more quickly and more fully than they might in a place like Europe, where the landscape is much different and much less natural in a lot of ways than what we have.
Well, it's interesting. That was my hypothesis about going to China this summer. We were going to go catch bats over there in urban areas, hard to find in China, and then some forest areas. And we went out to forest areas and hardly could get our hands on any bats to go into urban areas, and we have bats all over the place. So some bats like our habitat that we make. Some bats do not. So, I know we have 9 species down in the forest I work on, and there's probably 13, 14 in the state that have been seen there. So there is quite a bit of diversity there. But we only caught 3 species. Of course, we were only there for 3 weeks in the summer, so we didn't get everything. We were only in one city, so we didn't tour the whole country, unfortunately. But there is probably the chance that urbanization may improve habitat for some of our species. And I was kind of interested in this artificial habitat idea too. I tried to raise some bats in captivity, see how long I keep them alive. That's how I got some of these. Is they didn't make it, and that was back when white nose, because we were interested. Is it going to have the same impact down here? Will we have to maybe try and keep bats in captivity, because that's one way we've been able to save some species. Is rich people actually putting them in their own little zoos and keeping them in captivity, and now the buffalo is free to roam again, and perhaps if it hadn't been for that, it might not be. Of course, over here we believe in bats belonging to the people, and that's same for all wildlife and a lot of these natural resources that we have. As far as what I think is going to happen, I agree with what Brian says, and that's an interesting thing about ecology and animals' reaction to disturbances. As we know that a lot of times we throw out an insecticide and we kill 99.9% of the insects. Very effective. Well, 0.1% lives, and they have babies, and all their babies are resistant, and the population builds back up, especially with insects. And next thing you know, that insecticide doesn't work anymore because the animals are resistant. So with bats, could it be the same thing in Europe, that they're resistant now, and maybe in our bats there's some resistance? Of course, with endangered species that are already down and out and maybe suffering from low population sizes, low genetic diversity, they may not have that 0.1% around to bounce back. We may lose a species or two. That's certainly within possibility, especially for all these Myota species that we have that are already on the list. So this is not good news for them, but if they get down and there's still a significant population that can build back up, that's what I'm hoping, that there's this resistance eventually. Yeah, it's going to be low numbers for a long time. I'll be retired. You'll probably be retired too.
Absolutely.
But we're taking numbers down now where the good caves are, so that in the future, perhaps they can track the recovery and the return of the bats.
You had a follow-up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about resistance. So is there any thought of getting some resistant bats from Europe and trying to breed them with our bats as a way to protect
I thought about
the
that.
population?
Direct breeding wouldn't work. They're different species, and so there's no possibilities there. But from a genetic level, there's the possibility that maybe their bats that they have are resistant and have a segment of their genome, of their DNA that conveys that resistance. There's the field of biotechnology, recombinant DNA. Take a piece out of one organism, put it in another. We do it with crops all the time. We don't do it with animals very often. We do it with bacteria, but mammals, that's a pretty rare kind of scenario to deal with. It's come up. It's been discussed. But there are also very serious concerns about trying to do something like that. If we did it, kind of like what the plenary session was talking about, we bring this in, we try this approach. What if it has an unintended consequence? What if it gets easily spread through the population and makes them more resistant or more susceptible to something else, or it reduces reproduction or has some other effect that we can't anticipate? So I think most of the bat community is the biologists, conservationists are pretty opposed to the idea of trying that because it seems like it's probably not worth the risk. We'd rather see if there's some natural resistance than to try to tinker and maybe mess something up.
You've heard of the chestnut tree that was once very plentiful, and the blight, a fungus, wiped it out. And they've got the Chinese one that's very related, and they've bred it to have mainly American chestnut, but that part of the Chinese that's resistant. And we can pick up a gene in corn and put it over in soybean, and we do that already. And there's a possibility of doing that, but the unknowns are astronomical, and the biggest unknown is would it even work. So I think I would take a lot of research before. Some of the folks down the hallway from me, some of the molecular geneticists in my building, they're anxious to look at it and see, because that's the kind of work that they do. But we're a long way from finding that sort of a solution. But it has occurred to me that maybe we could, get some of their friends to come over, breed with some of our bats.
Are there any other questions right now? Because I want to tell you we've got one more opportunity here. Mr. Miller and Mr. Davis say that we may single file go up into the mouth of the cave and look around.
One time, this cave entrance, he just went, but there was a